My mother, pictured here, always said it was hotter than Hades the day you came to live with us, which was July 1st, 1949. I suspect this picture was taken shortly thereafter. Because on that day, her two best friends, fellow social workers from Catholic Charities in Dayton, brought me to live with Mary and Pete Reynolds, 5'1" and 5'6", respectively, and I was a whopping 20 pounds at 6 months. I always said I became short by environment. I have to explain when I say mom and dad and parents, a little vocabulary lesson here, that when I say my mom and my dad and my parents, I mean Mary and Pete Reynolds. I mean, these were the people who sent me to nursery school with an I like Ike button, and who I used to sit with at dinner and listen to the stock market report and learn how everybody could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that I began to believe that stockholders were probably about the most important people in America. I always knew that I was adopted, and I always knew that Mary and Pete Reynolds were my real parents. When people asked, I always knew that I belonged to them. And except for my brown eyes, you couldn't tell that I wasn't theirs. I mean, I was theirs. And I think it was that conviction that I belonged to them so strongly that I wiped out my curiosity about who those other people were, those birth parents. And I drove people crazy over the years because I had no desire to look for my birth parents or know anything about them. Except that wasn't exactly true. When I was really little, I had a recurring dream where I could see my birth mother looking for me. I'd say, I'm right here. I'm okay. I'm fine. But she couldn't see me, and she couldn't hear me. And that dream faded and eventually died, which is exactly what my mom wanted. My mom would say things as I grew older like, these adopted children who look for their birth parents, they sometimes come up with bad surprises. Like incest. But she had already told me that I was the pick of the litter. Her best friends had chosen me for that, so I knew I wasn't going to find that. And by this time, I also knew that we probably just had a very ordinary story of an unwed mother, and how interesting could that be? It was sad, but not very interesting. So, time passed, and by the time I was 10 years old, my dad had his first stroke, and then he died when I was a junior in high school. He was a great guy, and he really had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. But even then, I wasn't curious about my birth parents until I had my own children, and I just wanted to let my birth mother know that she had made a good decision, that everything had worked out fine. I really didn't care much about who she was. I just wanted to let her know that everything had turned out well. But by this time I had 4 children, and I'm a clutter dyslexic, and I have adult ADD syndrome, and on the very best days, I can't find my own keys, and it would cost thousands of dollars in hiring somebody with a deerstalker cap, and it was just overwhelming to think about that. And then I got into my 50s, and I began to realize that my birth mother was in her 70s, which really seemed old to me at the time, and this might be too late. And a friend said to me, it's got to be easy now on the internet. The internet! I typed in my adoption search, and there at the top of Yahoo search engine, remember Yahoo? It said, my adoption search in Ohio, and there was a researcher and links, and 2 weeks later, on my 52nd birthday, I had my original birth certificate for Suzanne Broussard White, and a non-identifying narrative from Catholic Charities, which read, your mother was tall and blonde and attractive despite her pregnancy. This is a great 1940s language. And I had become short by environment. And then the story takes a very unexpected turn, because it seems that my birth parents were married, and where did the unwed mother go? And That also explains why they had their same last name on my birth certificate, Mary and Joseph White. And they had met in New Orleans in college and had a planned wedding with an unplanned pregnancy, moved up north, and really began to realize that neither one of their families would have accepted a child conceived out of wedlock. And so they were giving me up for adoption. About 3 weeks later, my mom, suffering from memory loss and pneumonia, passed away. She was really a character. She loved being Irish, and I don't think she could leave the house, even to McDonald's, without earrings and lipstick. And she talked about my messy house by calling us Tobacco Road, but at the same time she bragged to everybody how smart I was, even to my adulthood. The last full sentence I remember from her, I had taken her to the doctor, and she hadn't been able to say a word all morning, and then the doctor walked in, and she perked up, and she pointed to me, and she said to him, "That's my baby." And in fact, I was. And I never told her about my adoption search. So after her funeral, I came back and found the researcher, and within 4 days, I had found Mary White's address back in New Orleans, and 8 brothers and sisters starting 11 months after I was born. Clearly, Mary and Joseph didn't grieve my loss too long. So, at any rate, the Catholic Charity said, "Don't show up at the door, don't call, send a nice thinking of you card." "Hello, Mary, I'm thinking of you. It's been since December 21st, 1948 since we last saw each other. Would love to be in touch." And then I waited, and after 3 weeks, I began to realize that this contact might not happen. She might not respond. And then a letter. And I opened it up, and it said, "What a kind and thoughtful way to introduce yourself. You've always been on my mind." And then the tone shifted. It said, "How did you find me so easily to contact anybody in my family?" And the bombshell, "Nothing the agency has is correct. I am jumping all over the living room for somebody who had no curiosity for 50 years. I am a basket case of my husband. Ray says you have her phone number." So we talked for 3.5 hours and found out that we were both English majors. We were both raised by social workers. We were both messy. And in fact, we were both named Mary Elizabeth, as was my mom. It's a common name, I guess. Anyway, so then she tells me the bombshell. She had been married to Joe, Mary and Joe, for 25 years. And to this day, he still thinks that he is my birth father, but in fact, he is not. They had met in college. He had already moved up to Ohio to a job, and they were planning this June wedding. And her family, her mother died when she was 18 months old. She was living with her mother's cousin, and they couldn't stand Catholics, and they were very upset that she was marrying when they were yelling and screaming matches every night. So she went to a childhood friend for comfort and consolation, which apparently led to something else because he's my birth father. And she said he was brilliant, and he was such a great and good person and decent person. I was friends with him until he died a few years ago. But I never told him about you because he would try to have made it right, and there was no way to make it right. And so a few weeks later, flew off to New Orleans. Anne Marie, my oldest, accompanied me there, and I'm expecting to find my brown eyes and somebody who looks like me, and this is what I found instead. Somebody with 17 sets of keys because she loses her keys, and then I watch her make lunch, and she goes from the coffee maker to the sandwich, and the sandwich to the coffee maker, and back and forth, and nothing's getting done, and I'm watching my ADD self in action. After lunch, we sat down, and she handed me her own baby cup and a necklace that had been worn by her mother, and she said, "I think we have in common looking for our lost mothers." And then she turned to my birth father's family, and she said they were very wealthy people in New Orleans. They were benefactors to many causes, politically liberal, Jewish. Jewish? This explains my son Quinn. When Anne Marie was born, Ray says, oh, she looks just like you. I said, somebody looks like me. When Quinn was born, he looked unfamiliar. Until I met the Jewish pediatrician. And in fact, a good friend of mine who's Jewish says, I didn't know you were Jewish, but I'm not surprised, because I always knew you weren't white bread. My kids are now thrilled to be a quarter Jewish, but we did not know the identity of the family. Mary kept that close to the vest until a few weeks later, I guess she thought, they were people of means, and so I could be a gold digger. But she sent me 2 books that my birth father had written. And so I typed his name in, good old Yahoo search. I typed his name in, Philip M. Stern, and he had written at least a half a dozen books and was the administrator of the Stern Family Fund, which financed projects in the public interest, including Seymour Hersh, the journalist's discovery of the My Lai massacres in Vietnam. So then I type in Stern Family New Orleans, and then off the screen there's just so many entries, because it turns out that my birth father's grandfather, that makes him my great-grandfather, it gets complicated, I realize, was Julius Rosenwald. He was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck for 25 years before his death in 1932, but more than that, he was one of the great philanthropists of the 20th century. He gave away $650 million in his lifetime, which is like $9 billion today. And in addition to founding the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, which he did not allow to be named the Rosenwald Museum, he contributed $6 million to found 5,000 schools for black children across the South, which he did allow to be called Rosenwald schools. I now have a heritage that matches my own adult beliefs. A friend of mine said, who was following this story, a friend from college, she said, you never did fit into that Republican skin very well. And in fact, I had been peeling it off over the years as I met people who had no bootstraps. And as I, through the generosity of Mary and Pete Reynolds, went to Catholic schools and discovered that my faith has great social justice teachings, and the Gospels tell us whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me. It's an amazing heritage, and I am humbled by it. But I still celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and I find that I really can't go out of the house much now without earrings and lipstick. I'm an Irish Catholic Jew. And I feel very lucky to have discovered that I am way more than just white bread. Thank you.